Of our midday talks from religious leaders who have blessed us with their presence here in the Palouse. Let me remind you that this talk will be followed by a third talk by Rabbi Foreman at 12:30. I invite you to stay for that. And in this evening, you may hear all three of our speakers in a panel discussion moderated by Pastor Dean Stewart at 7:30 in the sub ballroom, and so we hope you can make that. We're very excited. It's been a wonderful Borah Symposium so far, and this is, I think, the 57th straight Borah Symposium, for those of you who are counting. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you, especially to this talk by Hansuli Gerber, Reverend Gerber. He once had an honest profession. He was a farmer, and then theology took hold, and he became active in the Mennonite community and has worked around the world for peace and justice. And lately, he has worked for the World Council of Churches, situated in Switzerland, in a hopeful project called Decade to End Violence. He comes to us, though, directly not from Switzerland, but from Managua, where he flew early yesterday morning, I don't know, to be with us. And so we're very happy that he made all the connections, and he has the energy still to talk with us. So please help me welcome Reverend Gerber.
Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased and happy to be here. I have never been to Idaho before, although I have at least one friend in Idaho, in Boise, I believe. And but I've traveled much in the U.S. and I've worked for a U.S.-based organization for 11 years before working for the World Council of Churches. I am a Mennonite pastor, and I'm really happy to follow the talk of my brother, Imam Yahya. Thank you so much. You've spoken from my heart. And what I wanted to do is really following seamlessly, although I will be speaking about what happens in the ecumenical world, what the churches or the ecumenical movement worldwide are trying to do to build a culture of peace. And what we've seen just before until now very much is in that spirit. And in fact, you mentioned the earth as being God's, and that's what oikumene is about. Oikumene means the whole, the entire of the world, of earth, and it's a ship. We are all in the same boat together, being shipmen. I really like that. That's what oikumene is about. That's what the ecumenical movement is about. So what I'm doing here is not primarily to advertise the World Council of Churches, but just to give you a little bit of background so you can situate our effort for in building a culture of peace. And we've transferred the PowerPoint presentation, so some of the graphics are not exactly what they should be. The World Council of Churches is an international fellowship of Christian churches built upon the foundation of encounter, dialogue, and collaboration. The World Council of Churches was formed to serve and advance the ecumenical movement, the quest for restoring the unity of the church that was after World War II. Restore the unity of the church, which was severely broken after World War II, especially in Europe, but around the world as well, by encouraging in its members a common commitment to follow the gospel. The prayer of the churches which belong to the WCC is for the renewal and faithful response of the people of God in witness and service to the world. The membership of the World Council of Churches, about 400 million Christians, represented through more than 340 churches, denominations, fellowships in about 120 countries throughout the world. And remember the prayer of Jesus, that they might be one. And today that takes on new meaning as we move into the interreligious era. What does the World Council of Churches do? It promotes Christian unity through different programs, but it moves beyond that as well. And we don't have the time today to enter into what Christian unity means, although we could talk about that too. Here's just a few of here are basically the program departments as we have them. Diaconia Solidarity, mostly helping in relief and organizing development. Faith and Order, the theology department. International Affairs, Peace, Human Security. It's an advocacy on the UN level. A lot of that is happening there. Justice, Peace and Creation. Mission, Ecumenical Formation. The next World Missions Conference coming up in mid-May in Greece. Then you have the publications, public information. You have the Ecumenical Institute BOSSE that brings around students from around the world. Ecumenical Relations, Focus on Africa, and the Decade to Overcome Violence, which is what I will focus on today. And then Interreligious Relations and Dialogue, a small office about the same size as the Decade to Overcome Violence, which works not just on dialogue, but actually on cooperation, interreligious cooperation. The Decade to Overcome Violence spans the 10 years 2001 to 2010. And it's a worldwide movement. It's not a program of the World Council of Churches. It is a movement. And its theme, its objective really is about churches seeking reconciliation and peace. It runs parallel or within the framework under the umbrella of the decade of the UN declared Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence for the Children of the World, which is coordinated by UNESCO in Paris. UNESCO is one of the UN agencies, one of the many UN agencies, and works on promoting a culture of peace, particularly among youth. But the World Health Organization, which is based in Geneva, just next door to the World Council of Churches, has done the most work systematically to assess the situation of violence, to provide statistics on violence and the development of violence in the world, and to create a typology of violence, so to do analytical work on violence. And in 2002, a summary and a large, thick book report, World Report on Violence and Health, were published. In that report, it is documented that more than 1.6 million people die from violence every day. This is only the direct violence. This is not the structural or indirect violence. That's 4,400 deaths each day. And I should say here, out of these 4,400 deaths each day, now listen to this, 50%, half of these deaths are self-inflicted, meaning suicide, worldwide, half. 1/3 is interpersonal violence, mostly spouse violence. Women, mostly women being killed by their partners. 1/3 of all the casualties. Only 1/5 of these deaths worldwide are caused through collective violence, meaning war and terrorism. 1/5 only. And the media and governments try to tell us that the number one threat in the world is terrorism. However, there's other dimensions. We'll talk about these a little bit later. The World Health Assembly, meeting after the publication of the report, passed a resolution stating that violence prevention is now a public health priority, which means that the member states of the World Health Organization, which includes most nations of the world, are requested and required to set up violence prevention offices within their health ministries. And the Department on Injury and Violence Prevention in Geneva told us, the World Council of Churches, that we should encourage churches around the world to put some pressure on their health ministries and their governments, regional, national and local, to follow up on this effort in preventing violence. The World Health Organization describes the nature of violence as fourfold. There's physical violence, there's psychological violence, there is sexual violence, there's violence as in the form of deprivation or negligence, what we often call indirect violence or structural violence. Physical violence is relatively easy to assess. You can create statistics, and some of that is just what I showed to you. That's relatively easy to document, Psychological violence is very difficult to document. What do you include? How do you go about it? but it's very strong, and we would count under that category gender violence. Sexual violence is also very difficult to document. Most of that is, statistically speaking, in the dark. And deprivation or negligence, I'll come to that in a little bit. There's three different basic types of violence. Self-directed violence, which does include suicide and self-abuse. There's interpersonal violence, mostly between individuals, between 2 or 3 people, within the family, the partner community. And there's collective violence, social, political, economic, armed conflict. Gang violence, for example, would overlap between the interpersonal and the collective violence. Here, just quickly to show you the discrepancies by region in the world between homicide and suicide. Homicide meaning killings, and suicide being the self-inflicted violence. Again, these are deaths; these are not injuries. In Africa, you have a high rate of suicide, high rate of homicide, low rate of suicide. Whereas in Europe or in the Western Pacific, you have relatively low homicide rate, but a very high suicide rate. Just for your pondering. Violence takes place at any level of human life, individual, relationship-wise, community, societal. But there is an interplay of how violence works out and plays itself out. In that violence on one level informs or reinforces or increases violence on the other level. Dysfunctional families, history of abuse and violence in the family, poverty, crime in the community, weak institutions, poor legal provisions, all of these things play into that. So the World Health Organization again created what they call an ecological model of interpersonal. This is just about interpersonal violence, which is, the interpersonal violence is the fastest growing type of violence, fastest growing, and especially against women. Let me give you a little background of the Decade to Overcome Violence. That's what DOV stands for. The World Council of Churches has its most successful but also most controversial program ever was the Program to Combat Racism. That was especially directed at South Africa. Remember, Nelson Mandela, who in the meantime has become a world hero, was then in the public media and by governments, including the US government and the Swiss government, labeled as a terrorist. The World Council of Churches supported, affirmed, encouraged churches in South Africa, mostly black churches, who were revolting against apartheid. And that program was supporting these churches, which caused churches in the United States and in Canada, in Western Europe, to accuse the World Council of Churches of supporting terrorists. And that reputation, you can still find it on the website nowadays. It sticks with the World Council of Churches. But it was a successful program, at least in some ways. That was followed by the decade Churches in Solidarity with Women, which was mostly a decade of solidarity among women in churches. But it left some traces and it set some record for the Decade to Overcome Violence. In 1994, the main governing body of the World Council of Churches met in Johannesburg, and the Methodist Bishop Stanley Magoba, in his closing, in the sermon at the closing service, said that apartheid is gone, but violence is still with us. And he challenged the ecumenical movement, churches worldwide, to now convert the program to combat racism into a program to combat violence, which was eventually, the language has changed a little bit. You notice, how do you combat violence? Can you fight violence with violence? There was a lot of discussion about that. And so the program to overcome violence was launched, which in 1998 was then changed into a decade in light of the UN Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence for the Children of the World. And I'll very quickly go over the goals here of the decade, with 5 of them, addressing holistically the wide varieties of violence, which is really a huge spectrum, both direct and structural, in homes, communities, international arenas, and learning from the local and regional analysis of violence and ways to overcome violence. And that goes far beyond the Christian communities, obviously. Secondly, challenging the churches to overcome the spirit, the logic, and the practice of violence. You've heard the saying that war begins here. Violence begins here. And it is here. So the spirit and logic and practice of violence. And here comes the thing that caused some people to get cold feet, as we say, after this decision was made, to relinquish any theological justification of violence and to affirm anew the spirituality of reconciliation and active non-violence. Now, this is where some of the difficulty comes in. There's a lot of theology that justifies violence. There's a lot of Christians like to accuse Muslims of condoning violence. But look at our own language. Look at our own text, historic texts. Look at the Bible. How do we work with the texts that seem to condone or promote violence? That is something that we've got to take on. If we're pacifists, I'm from the Mennonite tradition. As a pacifist or a member of a pacifist church, I cannot just simply dump the texts in the Bible that seem to promote violence. I have to deal with them. So, another goal, the fourth one, create a new understanding of security in terms of cooperation and community, instead of in terms of domination and competition. Now, I just want you to realize that this issue of security that was formulated before September 11, 2001. So the whole hype about security is not a new theme. There was an awareness in the ecumenical movement before 9/11 that security is an issue, is a problem for us, that we need not just to simply increase and improve security, we need to create a new understanding of what it means. And finally, learning from the spirituality and resources for peace building of other faiths, and to work with communities of other faiths in the pursuit of peace, and to reflect on the issues of religious and ethnic identities in pluralistic societies. Hence, the effort, and that's one of the new priorities of the World Council of Churches, to work towards interreligious cooperation, because it's only together that we can overcome violence. The bombs, as we've heard earlier, the bombs do not know the difference between Christians and Muslims, or Jews, or Buddhists, or others. They don't know national borders. Oh, this is the final one here. Challenging the growing militarization of our world, especially the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. This is an effort that the World Council of Churches has worked with for many, many years. And in the 80s and 90s, churches had militarization fairly high on their agenda. Nowadays, you hardly find it. People seem to have become numb or indifferent or simply don't know. And I'm afraid that's the case. People simply don't know how much militarization is a big problem. I'm going to say just a few things about that in a couple of minutes. The Decade to Overcome Violence works on many levels and has many different entry points. Regional, national ecumenical organizations, the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace, even though the Catholic Church is not formally a member of the World Council of Churches, we work together closely on that. Member churches, denominational bodies, such as the Lutheran Church in America, or American Baptist, or the Methodists. You have ecumenical networks, special ministries, agencies, relief agencies, development agencies. There's an international coalition for promoting the UN decade. There's UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and other non-governmental organizations. Coming back to militarism now, there's a typo in here. I'm not sure whether you would notice. But in this year, 2005, the world will spend roughly $950 billion on militarization. That's a figure that none of your plain calculators can display. And none of our minds can comprehend how much money that really is. And I didn't have the time, or didn't take the time yet. I hope we can do some of that to make some comparisons of what it is. But in the mid-90s, this model here was worked out, and that was in the mid-90s. It will be worse now. 1/3 of the worldwide military expenditures would be sufficient to address the world's pressing issues, including starvation and malnutrition. By the way, did you know that in the US alone there's more than 12 million malnourished children in the US? And it's much worse in the South, of course. Malnutrition, shelter, nuclear weapons, refugees, deforestation, global warming, acid rain, ozone, the debt, the debt burden in the world, soil erosion, water, population stability, healthcare, HIV/AIDS, clean water, illiteracy, vaccination. All of those, if you ask specialists in these fields how much money they need to adequately address these issues nowadays, and you add all this money up, it comes to about 1/3 of this year's worldwide military spending. So there's something wrong with the priorities of our world's governments. And 50% of this whole spending, 50% is spent by the US alone. Hunger. According to the UN report on world hunger, which was published a few weeks ago, 1 child younger than 5 dies every 5 seconds. That's 20 every day. Today alone, 24,000 people will die of hunger in this world. And we know very well that hunger is not a natural disaster. It is not. It's not an accident. It's the result of wrong priorities, of poor communication coordination, and of a false economic order. Hunger is only one of the consequences of the world's economic and military priorities. It could be different. Another world is possible, but is there the will? If we don't even know about it, how we're going to change it? So, based on all that, here are the 4 themes for the DOV. Overcome the spirit and logic of violence. Start with ourselves, in my own mind and heart. Look together at the use, abuse, and misuse of power on every level, from the home to the community to the nation, and between ethnic or religious communities. Issues of justice, especially speaking of the economic globalization nowadays. And finally, religious identity and plurality. A study guide, a very modest study guide for small groups, and the grassroots was developed in 2002, which has been translated into about 10 languages and circulated over 50,000 times so far in churches around the world. Why violence, why not peace? And it's Bible studies around these 4 themes. You can find it on the website. I'm going to show you the website at the end. Now, some of the main issues that churches are picking up around the world. Domestic violence is one. This was a campaign on the Fiji island. Domestic violence really meaning violence mostly against women and children. Economic globalization is another issue that churches really work at, and which is a difficult one because churches in the South address it differently from churches in the North, which is why it's so important to exchange ideas and experiences with one another. I bumped into some people from South Dakota in Managua on Saturday night. Doctors who had gone there for a couple of weeks to bring medical attention to people out in the boonies, really outside of any civilization, so to speak. And I met one of them again on the plane back to Houston, and he said, this is a life-changing experience. He said, I'll never look at my own country and our society and the world the same. These kinds of encounters and exchanges are incredibly important, or we will have great difficulty to understand one another in our different perspectives. Another main issue for the churches is youth and violence. A friend of mine in Nairobi, Kenya, told me that next to AIDS, the biggest single threat to security in Nairobi and in many other African cities are young guys walking around the city with a gun. They don't have a shelter, they don't have a home, they don't have a family, they've never gone to school, they never had a job, but they do have a gun, and that's their survival kit. And they threaten the security of entire cities. And they're in large numbers, and most of these will have been child soldiers. They were abducted and forced into combat, in some of the countries in Africa where we've seen civil war. And churches work to build a culture of peace. And I don't need to go into lengths at this explaining to you what that means, a culture of peace. We've had that in the presentation just previously. I will, at the very end here, I'll come back to some of these things in our perspective here. Some activities that the World Council of Churches is doing, interreligious relations, and I would add interreligious cooperation, to promote interreligious cooperation. We live together. We have to address these issues together. International affairs works on impunity. Impunity being a huge challenge. I learned last week in Central America, we had a conference of about 50 women leaders from all over Central America. Last year, in Guatemala, where there's no civil war going on anymore, really, over 500 women were assassinated in total impunity. Not a single case has been picked up by the legal system or has been resolved. Impunity. And you can take it to many different levels. Restorative justice would be another one that's been promoted. Advocacy work. My colleagues of the International Affairs, prior to the war on Iraq, and I've wondered whether I should tell you about this, but I think I must. That department has contacted many member states of the UN prior to the war on Iraq to see what their information is, to provide them with information and background, what Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities are saying in the Middle East. And they discovered that a large number of member states of the UN had actually been bribed to become members, so that they become members of the coalition of the willing. Bribed. Speak of impunity again. So advocacy is very important. The churches and religious communities need to inform diplomats from countries around the world about what is going on the ground. We know that we cannot trust alone, put our trust alone in secret services of the nations of the world. As Christians, we should know that. Jesus already pointed to that in his conversation with the disciples. Human rights is another one. Peace building and disarmament, small arms. And there's one example here is the ecumenical accompaniment program in Palestine and Israel, which started some years ago, which accompanies both Jewish and Palestinian people, Jews or Muslims, Palestinian, Israelis, Arabs, through situations where they might be in danger of aggression. Justice, Peace, Creation works on women, youth, alternatives, globalization, creation, and environment. And coming back to the issue of violence against women, in Europe, and I don't think it would be much different in the US, in Europe, women of age 15 to 44, and that's according to the statistics of the European Union, these women have a higher risk of becoming victims of violence than of being victims of traffic accident or cancer. And according to the World Health Organization, again, the fastest growing number of victims of direct violence are women. Faith and Order, the theology departments works on theological reflection on peace, issues of power, anthropology, ethnic and national identity, and liturgy. Last week, one of the things that the women said at the end of the conference was that we've got to change our liturgical language, because there's things in there that make us continue with our assessments that violence, and especially gender violence, is okay. We've got to work on that. We have an annual focus, a moving focus, every year a different region or different country. And the purpose is to enhance the solidarity, encourage solidarity between local and regional churches around the world, to improve the information, so a better understanding of one another, move beyond stereotypes, move beyond our CNN filters, as I call them, and to celebrate. There is a lot of work going on. Our news just show us the bad news usually, but there's a lot of creative and peace-based work going on to celebrate that, to make it visible. The first focus in 2002 was on the illegal occupation. Of course, we can debate that. I mean, the formulation is debatable, but there's an issue there with the occupation. Out of that grew the ecumenical accompaniment program. In 2003, the focus was on Sudan, under the theme of healing and reconciliation. In the meantime, the peace agreement has been signed, but it's very fragile, and for peace to come will take a long time. In 2004, you may or may not know that, the focus was on the US. and the U.S. DOV committee, which is composed of members from the various ecumenical churches in the U.S., the theme was the power and promise of peace. It's going to filter down to the congregational level slowly, but it'll take time. The committee continues to work. Again, the focus, this was decided before the war in Iraq started. So it's not just about the war. Maybe the war is, if we go again by the statistical analysis of the World Health Organization, war is a minor issue because that's the smallest number of victims. The issue really is, do we believe that peace is possible at home as well as in the community? And does what seems to be peaceful to us, is that really peace? We know these themes from the Bible as well. Again, they say peace, peace, but there is no peace because people die of hunger. This year the focus is on Asia, under the theme Building Communities of Peace for All, and the interreligious dimension is very strong because Christian churches in most countries except the Philippines in Asia are small minorities. Next year it will be on Latin America, where the World Council Church Assembly takes place, and the theme is not clear yet, but I understand that youth and women are going to be very high on the agenda for that focus. 2007 focus will be in Europe, then the Pacific and the Caribbean in 2009. One thing that I want you to know is that the International Day of Peace, declared by the United Nations, September 21, has been declared last year for the first time in the WCC history as a International Day for Prayer of Peace, where churches, religious communities are invited around the world to pray for peace during services, observe 24-hour peace vigils, pray in particular for churches in the region of the annual focus. Last year on September 21, churches around the world prayed for churches in the US, and there's messages of peace from different people around the world that you can find, the videotaped messages they can find on the website. Some challenges I want to share with you, and then I'm winding up here slowly. We like to see the DOV not as a flurry of activities, of new programs or so, but as a spiritual journey, one of transformation. If we want to change the world, we need to be changed ourselves. Another challenge is the inter-church and interreligious cooperation. How can we work together when churches around the corner don't even know each other? That's a big, I know the US well enough to know that is a big challenge. You have small towns with I don't know how many churches, and these churches don't cooperate together. How can we work for peace together? Another challenge is breaking the silence, finding adequate language. We know that, let me say this. I had a group of Lutheran pastors visiting the World Council of Churches a year ago about. And we talked about domestic violence. And one of the pastors said, the day that we start talking about this issue in our church is going to explode. And I was kind of shocked. So how do we break the silence without creating an even bigger mess? Breaking the silence, okay, but how can we find adequate language? How do we talk about language? How do we talk about the victims? How do we talk about the perpetrators so that both, being human beings, can maintain or reclaim their dignity and their humanity? That is a big challenge, and we ought to think about that. One of the major challenges, however, that I like to really push people on is the confusion of conflict and violence. Just think about how the media talk about war, conflict, violence. They use these terms interchangeably. It's the same thing. Conflict means violence. When there's some violence going on, they use the word conflict. And all of us, we have a rather negative idea of conflict. I myself, people can find out how friendly they are towards conflict. That's kind of our upbringing and our natural temper and inclinations define that. But I'm someone who's rather shy of conflict, so I try to avoid it. But generally, the idea of conflict is a negative one. We think of conflict as sin, many Christians do. Conflict should not be. So if we can learn to make a difference between violence and conflict, say conflict is natural, conflict is normal, where people live together, there's going to be conflict. That starts right from the beginning of creation. There's nothing really sinful in conflict. Jesus had conflict, didn't he? And yet we affirm he was without sin. So conflict does have a constructive potential, which we need to claim and learn. We need to develop a positive attitude towards conflict. Violence, however, is always destructive. And even if one of the two parties or three parties involved in the violence seems to be successful and winning, it's going to be in the short run. It's going to come back. We know, maybe you've heard about the spiral of violence, but that is, violence is self-perpetrating. And a final challenge here is including environmental issues in, our violence against nature, against creation. Some insights that churches would affirm. Peace is central to the biblical perspective. A culture of peace begins in the church or in the religious community. That's where we need to start. That's where it has to be lived out. For building a culture of peace, religious communities must learn conflict, must learn to see conflict in the eye and deal with it constructively. A culture of peace is being built in faith and intercession. It won't go without it. Violent conflict, war, and violence in general is one of the demons that Jesus said will only go away with through prayer and fasting, which means prayer and fasting means transformation of the heart. A culture of peace embraces diversity. Maybe you've read the book of a Jewish author, Sachs. I forget his first name now. John Sachs. Thank you. The dignity of diversity. Unless we embrace diversity, we won't be able to build peace. And a culture of peace cultivates conflict. This is a farming area here. If you want to cultivate anything in the land, you have to cultivate, you have to dig. So you work the dirt, don't you? It's not that you love dirt, but you have to cultivate so that out of the dirt comes some vegetables, some fruit, some corn or wheat, or whatever it is. So conflict has to be cultivated so that it's livable, so that it creates transformation of us and of our situations. 4 attitudes for peace. Humility, we've seen that already this morning. I don't know the whole truth. Never. Commitment to safety, to the safety and the integrity of the other in all that. Acceptance of conflict, I'd already mentioned that. Hope, the transforming power of the Spirit. It is possible that it changes. I remember Milano Porcensky, a professor of theology, living under communism and teaching under communism in Prague, Czechoslovakia. That was still during communist times, and before he was General Secretary of the World Alliance Reformed Churches. He said once in a Bible study that to have faith in God means to believe that change is possible. And that's why he endured in the situation of communism in Prague as a Christian. And he was able to make a difference. And change did come. Not exactly the way one would have expected it. 4 skills for peace. Good listening. Have you ever thought about colonialism or colonialization in personal relationships? Some people who work on marital or family therapy or counseling use this language, and I find it incredibly helpful. We talk a lot about colonialism and the damage that is done in Africa and elsewhere. But think about the colonialism that takes place in couples and in families and in churches. Good listening, not tying the other down to what I think he or she is or should be. Truthful speak. Speak what I see and what I feel. Be truthful in my speech. Consideration for the community. Check my dreams and my visions and my perceptions against the reality, which is the community, which is diversity. And good process, and that goes especially for conflict, situation conflict. Slow down. In situation of conflict, slow down and include everybody. I remember from one of the lessons learned in Northern Ireland and during the war in Bosnia, or the wars in Bosnia, is that when violence happens, people become extremely stressed And we know that that stress can cause permanent damage. And when people are stressed, that's medically proven, their brain and their mental and emotional process slows down. So they need time. I saw a movie on the plane to Chicago when I came over a week ago or 10 days ago, where a woman was just about to confess to her husband that she had had an affair with another man. And she started speaking. He realized what she was going to say. She said, wait. One word after another. I need to be able to hear. I can't hear you. Research of police officers dealing with situations of extreme violence, street violence, has documented that these police officers, their hearing vanishes. It goes away. When they're under extreme stress, you cannot hear. So you need to slow down. You need to give the other person time. You need to give yourself time. And you have to include all the parties. Even the worst perpetrators have to be included in the process for peace. Peace begins with you, begins with me. I say, we have this thing, say no to drugs. Let's say no to violence. And peace is to be done with simple and profound acts. We don't need to create world peace tomorrow, but we can start on working on creating peace. I think I'm going to... How are we doing for time? We're doing okay?
Yeah, maybe.
I think I'll skip the questions and just give you the website here, and we can go into conversation for the remainder of the time.
So we have about 25 minutes for our questions and discussion.
Yes, please.
Dr. Gerber, I thought I heard you say, refer to this as a movement. Now, by that you don't mean, a Christian evangelizing movement. I think you're talking about what sort of movement? Can you define this as a social movement, as a cultural movement, a world movement?
We're trying to create networks. I believe that there is a movement. You would have noticed that over the last few years, the World Social Forum has gained a lot of weight. You have the World Economic Forum. You all know about that. That's big on the news, although it includes a tiny elite of the world's leaders. There is the World Social Forum, which has grown bigger and bigger every year. And it reflects, it's an expression of a movement that spans the world. Movement of people who begin to realize that if we are to survive as a human race, things can't go on as they are going now. So the movement is there. There is a movement. It's very diverse, and we're not going to organize it into a neat organization. And it has many different faces, many different expressions. What we're trying to do is to make visible and to give profile to the specific elements within that movement, within that worldwide movement, that work on creating positive attitudes for conflict and create, I was going to say, negative attitudes towards violence, because the tolerance, the level of acceptance and tolerance of violence is incredibly high, incredibly high. And that gets consolidated by what we see every day on the screen. So yes, there is a movement. Now, and churches and faith communities around the world have in their confession and in their commitments and in their vision, peace. Peace is part of what they confess, what they affirm, what they look for, what they hope for, what they work for. But how is it expressed, and how is it unified? How is it coordinated? How is it being brought together in today's world? I'd like to mention another book which I recommend for reading, and I don't have it with me. The author is Jonathan Shell. Jonathan Shell. The title is The Unconquerable World. He documents through examples, especially of the 19th and 20th century, how people's movements have overcome systemic evil. From South Africa to communism to other things. I don't know where we Westerners, West Europeans and North Americans get this idea from that the governments will take care of us and of the world. They won't. It's not even their task. Their task is to organize the life of society, to give some structure and order. But they will not create peace. They are not the kingdom of God. They will not bring the kingdom of God. They're not representatives of our religious beliefs. And that's where we come to the theme again of religion and violence. I'm moving beyond your question here from the movement. But to say that we're more and more people, and that's the movement, more and more people are convinced, or maybe they have not articulated, but there's this sense, there's this intuition that we've got to get together and work. In Northern Ireland, in 1995, the ceasefire would have been never possible. And neither the IRA, nor the British government, or the Irish Parliament would have ever come to a ceasefire had it not been for the pressure of the people in the communities in the streets, that they've had it. This is it. We can't continue. And it was mostly women organizing these communities and these rallies. Same thing in Sudan. The peace agreement in Sudan would not be in existence today had it not been for the women, especially in southern Sudan, starting to organize what they called the people-to-people peace process. Because the biggest problem for them was not the war the war between the Muslim government and the Christian South. The biggest problem for them was the infights, the in-house fights in the South between and among Christian communities. They say we can't go on. And so that's where it starts. And let's bring these movements together further. But they will be chaotic. I mean, things don't function in a neat way in movements. But I think we're in a point of history where, and that's the essence of democracy, isn't it? It's not that people go to cast their vote. The essence of democracy is that people take responsibility for what they're doing. So, well, yes, let me stop here. Sorry. Otherwise, we will. There's another question.
I just had the great privilege of going to Cambodia this year. And as an American, that you mentioned the juxtaposition, some of you actually saw in contrast, anyway, the fact that we don't know, we don't really understand, at least I didn't, and many of you have probably traveled, but to be able to go and to actually see the world, see the other half of the way that the world is. And what really was an impact for me was violence is a symptom, and the cause is what I see, rage. I see that as a trauma in the people, especially in the children, and so that you have all these generations that are coming up. And I see as a political movement, peace can be that, but if it's only here, I mean, we have compassion, but until we're in the face of it, can you talk on that? I mean, as far as having some kind of talk about political movement, but until people are moved, I don't know. I mean, it's something that goes very, very deep and is really intellectual. I work with Native Americans. If anybody is Native here, I'd say that's great respect and honor. And I'm working with a woman in Vegas Valley who is working on what she calls red rage. And she says there's red rage, white rage, black rage, everybody's got it. And she's specifically working with that. And I see that as part of the movement, part of the task. So that's all I want to say. If you have anything to say on that, well, council, church, anything else I can.
Thank you. Well, I believe in the end it's a spiritual process on the individual level of getting to that point. There's different things that can trigger that. It can be a visit to Nicaragua. It can be for young people. It can be or retired people. And I've worked for a service agency. We've had retired couples go to Siberia for 3 years, and it changed their worldview. For some people, it is getting to the point of saying, we've had it. We're just not going to put up with this violence anymore. And that's what women in Northern Ireland did. They said, this is it. We're going to have to do something. We created a short video, 13 minutes, Religion, Power and Violence. It was based on an interreligious consultation that we had on the subject last June. And there's a woman from Bosnia, and she said that she fled the war with her children. She realized that's not a life. So she went back to Bosnia in the middle of the war with her children. A mother raising her children in a situation of war. As a refugee at home, so to speak. And she says one day she realized, no one is going to stop this war. Who will stop this war? No, those who would like to can't. So she said, she realized that no matter how small her power was, she was going to do what was in her power to change this, at least for her immediate surrounding. And she did. And she's been a peacemaker for all this time. And her effort has made big difference in the communities. So, but what brought her to that point was the realization that I'm just not going to put up with it. That also means not to be diverted from it. That means looking the horror in the eye. Some of you will remember that the book that was written maybe in the 70s, early 70s, Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I still marvel today, 30 years later, how prophetic that was. That goes for the West, for the North of this planet, and for the Western nations. We've got enough stuff to keep ourselves amused and busy and diverted and with the advertisements, that we can afford to look away from the world's problems. Once you're in the middle of this situation, be that in Central America, there was a woman from Colombia at the conference over the weekend in Nicaragua. They don't have time to divert themselves. This is sheer survival. So that's how they become engaged and convinced of what they must do. It will not change the root causes necessarily right away. So I don't know. It's not great help. And I live myself in a privileged, I'm a white man from Western Europe. My problem is my midlife crisis. So how am I going to change the world?
My question, I believe when you spoke about the spiritual economy, it really is the core of the issue for so many. But we also have the economic impoverishment, we have environmental impoverishment, we have cultural impoverishment.
Right.
So when you're overcoming violence, how are you tying all these together? Because without addressing these peripheral things, there's no way to be able to spiritually develop when they are smart.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Thank you for bringing that up. I've learned so much from peacemakers, especially in Northern Ireland and in the Balkans during the 90s. And one thing that I always remember in that context is that it takes many people, many approaches, and many visions to make for peace. The world is too big, for one thing. The issues are too complex. The challenges are too many for any one of us, or even any organization, to tie it all up into one neat package and deal with it appropriately. So what can we do? And I think it's to create that space within ourselves and in our communities to allow different entry points and to respect entry points that take a different approach maybe, or different style, or have a different agenda. That's why I think political parties that are single agenda, well, that's not a problem in the US. You have only two parties, so I'm saying that to Europeans usually. Political parties that have one single agenda, which, of course, political parties here maybe have one single agenda item, and that's to get more power. But single agenda political parties are dangerous because the world is not that simple. It's just not that simple. So I think a large part of it is not just to be tolerant. Tolerance is not enough. What it takes is love and compassion. And I define compassion as a combination of intensity and perseverance. That includes my feelings, that includes my hands, that includes my brain, my what I've learned, my training, and my feet, and my heart. It takes compassion. And that's how we will overcome the spirit and the logic of violence. As you say, violence is on all these levels in these things. Now, I didn't show this slide. Peace is elusive, and peace is made painfully. There's no such a thing as, we have a mess now, let's create peace and we'll be fine. No. Peace is not a state of affairs. Peace is a way, is a process, a path. And it's made painfully. It demands sacrifice. And yet, as a Christian, I believe that Jesus has overcome violence, even though he succumbed to violence. In the midst of that, by not giving the final word to the ones that were perpetrating the violence. In his prayer, he said, "Forgive them because they don't know what they do." And that's precisely what I'm afraid is the cause of the perpetuation of violence, is that we don't know when I commit violence against someone, I don't know what I'm doing. And members of a family where there's violence, they don't know what goes on. So our ignorance about the mechanisms of violence perpetuate violence. That's why I say a humanity that lets 24,000 people every day die of hunger doesn't know what it's doing. So let's learn, and that's I think that's a process that we're on the way together.
Can you tell us in some specific places where Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and so on, the world's major religions are cooperating? I know that in general it's all the way through your presentation, but if you could be more specific about where you see the interreligious groups entering into this decade of overcoming violence, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I know there would be many good examples in the Middle East, but I'm not familiar with that place and with these people or projects. There would be examples in Asia. The examples that I know best are the ones in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, and in Serbia, and usually what it took was someone that had the courage and the clout to call religious leaders or religious representatives or members of different religious communities up and say, "Hey, let's get together." And, religious cooperation might sound like a big thing, but it can start as simply as that case in Serbia, where they were to have interreligious meetings where they would talk about how to improve the life of the community together, and the Catholic priest never showed up. Or was it the Orthodox? I forget. And anyway, he never came to the meetings. So the convener of the meeting went to his place, and here he was painting his fence around the building. And she said, why are you not coming to our meeting? And he said, "I don't have time. No one helps me take care of my parish and of the, and look how bad it is. So I've got to work. I don't have time for conferences." I've heard this from other religious people, though. I don't have time for conferences. That's maybe a fair statement sometimes. So what this woman, organizer of these meetings, did is she called the other guys up and said, "Let's go to the Orthodox church and let's work together on painting the fence." And that's what they did. It took a little bit of convincing, though, for some of them. But that was the beginning. That was the end of theoretical conferences, and it was the beginning of joint community projects that people had been ready for a long time. The reason they didn't get into this was that the religious leaders weren't ready for them. I can, as a religious leader in my own church, I can say that. Oftentimes, it's the leadership of the religious communities that are blocking or slowing down progress. Again, I come back to the people power, the movement. It's there. Our institutions are sometimes, slowing it down. So that's an example. And then what they do is bring young people together in work projects, and it does create that change. It does create that change that's necessary so that there can be a culture of peace in the middle of incredible crises. Unemployment, gangs, poverty, corruption, in the midst of all this, you can still have a community of peace where there is a good number of people working together to alleviate suffering of individuals and of their own community. It takes many people to do that. It takes only 2 or 3 to create a big mess. You know, how many people does it take to shatter a community? Think of the shootings at schools that happened here in the US or in Germany. It takes 1 or 2. It doesn't take many people. But again, I'm diverting from your question. There was your example. Another example would be in Malaysia, where the Christian church is a very, very small minority, but the Muslim society and the government, which is known as an Islamic government in Malaysia, is very cooperative, and so are the Christians. So they're organizing together in specific community projects. Even the Malaysia government, together with the Christian church in Malaysia, put on an international conference to which they invited Jacques Chirac, the French president, and he went. So cooperation is possible and happens at all these different levels, and that's important to have the various different levels involved. Peace is not going to be made just at the top level or just at the bottom level. It's important it happens at these different levels and cooperation as well. There was another hand, I think. Yes.
General Galera yesterday spoke about the children soldiers, and you spoke about
Child soldiers, yes. Yeah.
And you spoke about them carrying their gun, how that gun is their only mechanism for survival. From both presentations, there is a sense that the whole world is complicit in that. The whole world is complicit in many of those acts of violence because we turn our face, because it doesn't deal with me personally, our perception. So I'd like you to challenge us. This is a class that looks like it's mixed ages, mixed backgrounds, truly, it's pretty diverse. So give us a challenge that when we leave this room, or for this evening, by the end of this week, we would have accomplished something that, opened that door for us to think about the others as us.
Mm-hmm. I would need what comes to my mind, what jumps to my mind right away. This morning on television, I saw the Idaho Senator Craig is his name.
Yeah.
Is that right? I saw him talk about the immigration issue and the immigrants' right to work and to eventually become citizens. I liked what he said. I was only about 2 or 3 minutes that I listened. But he said, when people stand in line for 10 years to get work and to get food, then when in the end they get it, you can't say that they have not earned it. Who of us, citizens of the US, and I would say the same for Switzerland, would be ready and willing and put up with 10 years of standing in line to get the least of the jobs that anyone wants, and then be accused of getting something that he has no right to. That's in essence what he said. I like that. So here's a challenge. Support your senator in that issue. I don't know what he's saying about other issues. I don't know what he's saying about Iraq. I have no idea. See, I'm innocent, ignorant on there. But affirmance, I would say the first step to making peace is not resistance. It's affirmation. Learn to affirm the things that make for peace. And to watch out for the small thing, the simple and profound thing. Watch out for it. Affirm it. Make it visible. Tell people about it. Even if it's your favorite enemy, or your favorite political enemy. If he or she does something good, affirm it. Go to him or go to her or write and say, this is nice, I like that, that's good. That's the first thing that's necessary. That's the first challenge. Affirmation of the things that make for peace. Resistance comes at some point too. And the challenge is there, am I willing to resist something and accept in exchange to be, to lose face, or to be accused of whatever it is, or to lose some of my privileges or advantages? That's going to be a little bit more tough. I think as a Swiss, as a non-US citizen, I've lived in the US twice, and I sometimes wish I had a green card, or my children that are now grown would have had would have been born here, it would have made so much easier because we have so many friends here. So I speak in a way as one of yours, but then I speak as a world citizen too. When I say that one of the challenges that, and I formulate that on behalf of many, many friends around the world, is when you see your government doing things that kills many, many people around the world, don't just watch. I don't know what's effective in this country. I know that there's a lot of lobbying. I know that the U.S. citizens among the people in the whole world are the ones that write the most letters to their governments, local or federal. That's not that common in other places, but that's maybe also the only way that you can say something. I don't know. The U.S. government is a very centralist government. Actually, the president is actually like a king, isn't it? I mean, he decides, doesn't he? He decides. He decides war, yes or no. That's his decision. Of course, there's pressures, but if you want to be part of the decision, then speak your mind. And if you think that, well, it's not nice, but it has to be done, go ask the people that are affected by it. When you travel around the world on your holidays, go look up the Christian community or the Muslim community. Go talk to the people of the community. Don't just go to the tourist sites, to the souvenir shops. Ask for the local restaurant where the locals eat, the locals. If you can communicate with them, talk to them. Talk to them and find out what they think, how they see the world, and what their daily struggle is, what their difficulties are. It's easy to do that. You're going to travel anyway. And for those who can afford it, time-wise, sign up for a voluntary service with some organization. Go overseas, spend 3 years. And I say 3 because a year is too short. Anything shorter than a year is tourism anyway. What you do is you learn much more than what you give. Don't go somewhere to give to change the place within a few weeks. You can't do that. But you can change yourself. There's this Parisian guy who went to London, and after a few weeks or months, he wrote a letter back home. And he said, "I'm learning a lot more about Paris while I'm in London, than I would have ever learned about Paris had I stayed at home." And he started realizing how little he knew, not just about London, but also about Paris. I've heard the same metaphor being used in our interreligious encounter. I learned, my friend Imam from Rashid Omar from South Africa said that in prison, he was in prison during apartheid in South Africa. In prison, he said, in talking with his Christian friends who were also imprisoned, he learned a lot more about his own Islam than he would have ever learned. And so I think that's the challenge. Learn about yourself by seeking the encounter with the others. But if you want to make a difference overseas, then you have to stay at least 3 years. A friend of mine who is from the US, he went to Northern Ireland after college to help work for peace in Northern Ireland. It took 12 years until he got invited. He was a historian, and he was very knowledgeable about the history and the roots of the conflict in Northern Ireland. It took 12 years until he got invited by Northern Irish institutions to give lectures on the situation. 12 years. Finally, he got the citizenship, but that's another story. So that's another challenge. Give yourselves. Give yourselves. I could go on, and I'm going to start preaching here if we continue. There's more questions, yes, or more comments.
You spoke about that in 12 years, like rapidly talked about challenges. You would also mention in times of conflict, slow down. We live in a culture of immediacy. We live in a culture of short attention spans. And can you address how this need for constancy, focus, sustained focus can achieve nonviolence in, suddenly perhaps in this decade of which we're speaking today, when so much about us is changing quickly. We expect to
Right.
we have short election cycles, for example. How do we accomplish this as people? How do we maintain our cultural focus on
Boy, this is you're bringing up a subject that would be more than a week-long seminar worth. You're right. We live in a culture of instantaneous expectations and results, and we dash from one thing to another. I know these people have to go to class. There is no, that's just the way it is. So we live a fast-paced life. It was refreshing to be for a few days in Nicaragua last week, because you get there an hour later, you wait for the bus, it's not coming, and then you think we're going to miss the next bus, but since that's leaving late, who cares? I mean, it's just slower. So can we slow down? I don't know. Sometimes we can, but we can at least make an effort to slow down. But I think, again, I come to the spiritual, moral, and cultural basis of what we're doing. I think that, and that doesn't matter whether you're Christian or something else. I think that we've got to make space in our life, for emptiness, for silence, where we wait. I know that a lot of people can't do that. I know people, especially men, they had an accident or a disease and they had to go to the hospital. That was, he said, the most difficult lesson in their life was to learn to be silent, to just be and not run and not do and not, we live in an instant culture. Instant coffee, instant soup, instant anything. Although, I hate these waiting lines. I think one of the worst things that the U.S. is doing to us foreigners who travel to the U.S. is that we have to put up with these security lines for an hour or two, standing, waiting. I hate it with passion. But then I think it's maybe not that bad a thing, because it forces you to think. It forces you to look at people and to just be there. I don't have power over this. It's not that bad a thing in the end. So for me, that's one of the lessons, but I have a hard time accepting it. But I really believe, I'm not sure whether that's where that gets at what you were looking for, but I think that to be peacemakers and to work for overcoming violence, we have to develop what in our tradition we would call spiritual disciplines. And one of the primary ones is the one of silence, of waiting. The Quakers would call that waiting on God. And that's why they have silent service, which is hard for many of us to do. We're just not used to it. I can't believe the pace of the pictures on television here, or of films. I prefer slower movies, but again, that's a matter of enculturation and conditioning that we undergo, that everything happens so quickly. And I think that is doing violence to who we are as human beings. So the violence begins right there. Yeah. Let's leave it at that. I think it's time.
Yeah, I think